What if Australia was discovered and colonized by the Japanese? By Jessica Jahal. On the left, we have the Australian flag as it is today, and on the right, we have what it might have looked like if Australia had been colonized by the Japanese. Cause. Australia was discovered by Europeans in 1606 by the Dutch and Spanish. In the 1770s, voyages led by James Cook established British claims to the territory, where they were looking to see if it was land good for colonization. Europeans were enabled by their superior military and naval technology, which gave them a significant advantage over the indigenous population. This came from the advances during the Age of Exploration. Motivations for colonizing included economic and agricultural ones, since Australia was seen as being full of resources. It was also a much needed room for convicts, since after the United States independence, they could not send criminals there. Another motivation was imperialism, where countries tried to gain more territory and colonize more people to increase their prestige. There was also social Darwinism, where some groups thought they were better than others and therefore deserved to live. Significance. 90% of the indigenous population was killed due to European colonization. This was from a variety of things such as disease, occupation, and conflict. Some troubles with the early settlements were getting supplies to Australia since it was a remote location and was pretty far from Europe. However, they managed to incentivize settlers with free labor from conflicts, free land, and free passage. Today, modern Australia has a British influence on politics with its representative government, language, since it's still predominantly English, society, culture, and also the economy, since they've had historically large amounts of trade between the two countries. So in order to suppose that Australia was colonized by the Japanese, we have to look into what was happening in Japan at the time. From 1603 to 1867, which would be a reasonable period to assume that this discovery and colonization happened, Japan was in the Edo period. This was characterized by a withdrawal from foreign politics and focusing on domestic stabilization. There was also a policy of sakoku, which is translated to the closing of the country. So you can say isolationism. The only European country that Japan had contact with at this time was the Netherlands, because they were seen as able to separate religion from trade. Before this, Japan had more trade with other Iberian countries, but then they didn't like the influence of Christianity, so they closed themselves off. Some motivations for Japan for colonizing could have been power, trade, prestige, and rangaku, which is the study of Dutch literature and culture. So through the trade with the Dutch, it could be reasonable to assume that Japan got naval resources for colonizing through them, since they actually did lend them warships once. Individually, people such as Tokugawa Yushim, who is pictured at the top, could have pushed for colonization as a way to increase his own power with the emperor. In Japan, there was a famine having to do with the rice crop at the time, so the discovery of Goshu could have been, and its agricultural resources could have been, a big motivator for it to be colonized. In fact, Australia is perfect for the cultivation of sweet potatoes, which are a popular rice substitute that was also used in Japan when this famine actually happened. The way they could have brought settlers to Japan, to Goshu from Japan, would have been to promise them a higher status while putting the natives at the lower class. Japan's lower class at this time were actually considered subhuman, and they were treated as complete outcasts from the society. The reason I believe that these indigenous people would be considered subhuman by the Japanese would be because they make similar comparisons between other nomadic tribes in Central Asia. So So, in the long term, how would Japanese colonization affect the country? There would be less natives dead, but there would also be a loss of culture as it would be absorbed into Japanese culture, tradition, and etc. Eventually, though, with the class system being relaxed up, they would have upward social mobility, especially after World War II. The effect on Japan would be that it would become an imperial power much faster and to a much higher degree. There would also be a small amount of Aboriginal culture influencing Japan itself. In terms of Goshu today as a country, as an independent country, it would have closer economic ties with Asia and closer diplomatic ties, and it would also be culturally tied to Japan. This would be an advantage, especially with the economic part, because Asia right now is one of the biggest economic regions. Another result would be that Britain would be less powerful since it didn't get to colonize Australia, and that could have led to a shift in European power dynamics as well, perhaps giving more favor to France. So, in my opinion, in the long term, Goshu would be the better country. So, the framework I established was it's best to look at the two modern countries, Australia colonized by the British and Goshu colonized by Japan. This is because, respectively, whichever country colonizes Australia or Goshu, they will each have the benefits, and you can't really give an opinion as to um, which one deserves it more or which power dynamic would be the best. So we can look at which country would be better objectively. So for the natives, under the Japanese, they'd become the lower class and their culture would be lost. But with Australia, over 90% of them were wiped out. So it could be argued that it's better to be in the lower class but still be alive. As for settlement under the Japanese, it'd be gradual since Goshu would be mostly used for agriculture, but the British were very eager to settle Australia because they created a penal colony. They needed the room to send people. In terms of economy, the country today would either be predominantly reliant on Asian or Western trade. The reason why Asian trade is more advantageous because today in the modern time, Asia's trade is growing and it's a powerful economic region as compared to Europe. In fact, Australia right now its trade with Europe has been slowly declining, and Japan is actually one of its biggest trade partners after China. So the politics upon establishment under Japan, it remained a loosely centralized system, possibly a monarchy, while with Australia, there was representative government. So representative government is better since more people get a say in politics. But in the long term, Goshu would also become a representative country because of the global trend. And so the advantages of Australia seem to be mostly in the short term with settlement and politics. Therefore, you can say that Goshu would be the better country because in the long term, its advantages remain. The end.